Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Before the ideas begin, a small request: most of you who watch are not subscribed, and we've noticed this in the numbers, in the gap between views and the audience that stays. We post every single day, we put care into each script, each thought, each question that unfolds in the dark, and if these videos have become part of your nights, if they help you think or drift, or simply exist in that space between waking and sleep, consider subscribing, hitting the like button, turning on notifications so you know when the next one arrives. And if you feel moved to do so, leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from. What philosophical question occupies your mind the most? What idea you return to when everything else falls away? These small gestures matter more than you might think. They allow this work to continue. They allow these ideas to reach others like you, scattered across the world, awake in the quiet hours. Now the introduction ends and the philosophy begins. Language pretends to capture the world, pretends to translate experience into symbols that can be shared, but the translation is always incomplete, is always leaving something behind, something essential that resists being put into words, and this resistance is not a failure of vocabulary, not a problem that could be solved by inventing new terms or refining definitions, but is structural, is built into the nature of language itself, into the gap between the thing and the word for the thing, between the experience and the description of the experience. And this gap is not empty, but is filled with silence, with the ineffable, with everything that can be shown but not said, felt but not expressed, known but not communicated. And the knowing that cannot be communicated is most of what matters, is the substance of experience, is the raw sensation of being alive, of being conscious, of existing as this particular point of awareness at this particular moment. And no arrangement of words can convey this, can make someone else feel what is felt, can bridge the gap between one consciousness and another, because words are public, are shared, are defined by use and convention, while experience is private, is immediate, is defined by the perspective from which it arises, and perspectives cannot be shared, can only be described, and description is always external, is always at a remove, is always pointing towards something rather than presenting it. And the pointing is all that language can do, is the limit of what symbols can achieve. And the limit is reached quickly, is encountered as soon as one tries to say what anything is really like, what it feels like from the inside, what quality it has that makes it this experience rather than that experience. And the thisness cannot be said, can only be shown, can only be gestured toward, and the gesture is not the thing, is not a substitute, is only an indication that there is something there, something beyond the words, something in the silence beneath language. And the silence is not absence, but presence, is not the lack of sound, but the space where meaning lives before it is forced into form, before it is compressed into sentences, before it is reduced to the linearity of speech, and speech is linear, is one word after another, is sequential, is bound by time. While experience is simultaneous, is layered, is happening all at once in ways that cannot be captured by the march of syllables. And the march misses the music, misses the texture, misses the way that experience is not composed of discrete elements that can be named separately, but is a continuous flow that is divided by language into artificial units. And the units are useful, are necessary for communication, for thought, for the organization of experience into manageable pieces. But the organization is a lie, is a convenience, is the imposition of structure onto something that has no structure, or has a structure so complex, so multidimensional, that it cannot be mapped onto the one-dimensional track of language. And the track is narrow, is constraining, is forcing everything to line up, to follow rules, to fit into grammar. And grammar is a cage, is a set of requirements that limit what can be said, how it can be said, what relationships can be expressed. And the relationships in experience are not grammatical, are not subject-verb-object, are not causal in the simple sense that language demands, are more like music, more like the way that notes relate to each other, not through logic, but through resonance, through harmony, through the ineffable rightness of certain combinations. And rightness is not a property that can be defined, can only be recognized, can only be felt. And the feeling is what language cannot capture, is what remains in the silence, is what is lost when experience is translated into words, and the loss is total, is not a matter of degree but of kind, because words and experience are different types of things, are operating in different domains, and the attempt to convert one into the other is like trying to describe colour to someone who has never seen, and the description can list properties, can talk about wavelength and frequency, can use metaphors, can compare it to other experiences, but none of this conveys what colour is, what it is like to see red, and the like is the problem, is the word that points to the gap, to the subjective quality that cannot be communicated, can only be experienced. And experiencing is not communicating, is not sharing, is not the public act that language performs, but is the private act that language can only gesture toward. And the gesture is clumsy, is inadequate, is using blunt instruments to point at something delicate, something subtle, something that disappears. When focused on too directly, when examined too closely, when forced into the harsh light of explicit statement, and explicit is what language demands, is what words require, is the naming of things, the drawing of boundaries, the making of distinctions, and distinctions are violence, are cuts, are the separation of what is continuous into discrete parts, and the parts are not the whole. Cannot be reassembled into the whole, because the relationships between parts are not the same as the parts themselves. And language can name the parts, but cannot capture the relationships, except through more words, more parts. And the regress is infinite, is never arriving at the thing itself, is always operating at a remove, in the space of representation, rather than the space of presence. And presence is what is lost, is what words cannot hold, because words are abstract, are general, are applying to many instances rather than this instance, this particular moment, this unique occurrence that has never happened before and will never happen again. And the never again is what makes experience precious, is what gives it weight, is what makes the silence beneath language so full, so rich, so irreducibly important, because the silence is where the particular lives, where the unrepeatable exists, where the singular moment is happening, and language can only speak in universals, in categories, in types, and types are not tokens, are not the actual things, but the classes that actual things are sorted into. And the sorting is useful, but is also destructive, is losing the individuality, the specificity, the exact quality that makes this thing what it is. And what it is cannot be said, can only be pointed to. And the pointing is metaphor, is analogy, is the attempt to convey the unknown through the known, the ineffable through the effable, and the attempt always fails, is always inadequate because the known is not the unknown. The metaphor is not the thing, is only similar, only resembling, only sharing some properties while lacking others, and the lacking is what matters, is what makes the difference, is what remains unsaid in the space between the metaphor and the meaning. And the space is where poetry lives, where art lives, where music lives, because these are the forms that acknowledge the failure of literal language, that work in the silence, that use words or sounds or images not to say, but to show, not to define, but to evoke, not to capture, but to suggest. And suggestion is not statement, is not the bold claim that this is what it is, but is the tentative offering that maybe it is something like this. Maybe if you attend to this pattern, this rhythm, this arrangement, you will feel something similar to what I felt. And the feeling is the goal, is what art aims for, is the communication not of information, but of experience. And the communication is never complete, is never total, is always leaving room for interpretation, for the receiver to bring their own experience, their own associations, their own silence to fill in what the words or notes or images cannot say. And the cannot say is most of it, is the majority of what is being communicated, is happening in the spaces between words, in the pauses between notes, in the negative space around the image. And these spaces are not empty, but are full, are where meaning accumulates, where resonance happens, where the ineffable makes itself felt without ever being named. And naming is the death of the ineffable, is the attempt to drag it into language, to make it explicit, to pin it down, and the pinning kills it, turns it into something else, something smaller, something manageable, but also something false. Because the ineffable is not manageable, is not controllable, is not subject to the will, is only encountered, only experienced, only allowed to happen. And the allowing is what silence does, is what the spaces between words permit, is the acknowledgement that there is more than can be said, that language is not everything, that meaning exists in the pre-linguistic, in the non-verbal, in the realm that infants inhabit before they learn to speak. And learning to speak is learning to lose something, is gaining the ability to communicate, but losing the directness of experience, the unmediated encounter with the world. And the mediation is what language provides, is what symbols do. They stand between the self and the world, between experience and consciousness. And the standing between is interpretation, is the conversion of raw sensation into meaningful categories. And the categories are necessary for thought, for memory, for the organization of experience into narratives. But they are also barriers, are obstacles, are preventing direct contact with what is actually happening. And what is actually happening is ineffable, is beyond language, is in the realm of pure qualia, of raw feeling, of the what it is like that resists all attempts to be captured in words. And the resistance is not stubbornness, but impossibility, is not a challenge to be overcome, but a limit to be accepted. And accepting the limit is what Wittgenstein meant when he said that what can be shown cannot be said, that there are truths that can only be displayed, only demonstrated, only lived. And the living is the showing, is the way that meaning manifests in action, in gesture, in the way a life is shaped. And the shaping is not describable, is not reducible to rules or principles or propositions, is only visible in the particular, in the concrete, in the specific way that this person moved through the world. And the moving cannot be captured in biography, cannot be preserved in narrative, because narrative is selection, is choosing which moments to include and which to leave out. And what is left out is most of it, is the ordinary, the unremarkable, the moments that do not fit into story. And these moments are where life actually happens, are where experience is most dense, most rich, most full of the qualities that make it worth living. But they are also most resistant to language, most stubbornly ineffable, most insistent on remaining in the silence. And the silence is not the enemy of meaning, but its ground, is the space from which meaning emerges, is the background against which words appear. And without the background, the words have no context, no resonance, no way to mean more than they literally say. And literal meaning is thin, is insufficient, is the bare minimum of what language can do. And what language can do is not impressive when compared to what experience is, when measured against the fullness of consciousness, against the complexity of a single moment of awareness, which contains more information, more nuance, more texture than could be expressed in a lifetime of speech, and the lifetime would not be enough, would never catch up, would always be lagging behind the present moment, describing what has passed rather than what is passing. And the passing is too quick, is too fluid, is too continuous to be caught in the discrete net of words. And the net has holes, has gaps, has spaces through which most of experience escapes, and the escaping is not loss but necessity, is not failure, but the acknowledgement that language is a tool, is an instrument, is good for certain purposes, but not for all purposes, and the purposes it is not good for include the most important ones. Include the communication of what it feels like to be alive, to be conscious, to be the experiencing subject rather than the experienced object. And the subject is ineffable, is beyond language, is what looks out from behind the eyes but cannot be captured in description, cannot be made into object without ceasing to be subject. And the ceasing is what happens when language tries to grasp consciousness, tries to make it explicit, tries to say what the self is, and the self dissolves under scrutiny, becomes elusive, becomes nothing that can be pinned down. And the pinning down is what language wants to do, is what definition aims for, is the fixing of meaning, the stabilization of reference, the establishment of clear boundaries. But consciousness has no clear boundaries, bleeds into the world, into the body, into the past and future. And the bleeding is what makes it alive, what makes it dynamic, what makes it impossible to freeze into the static forms that language provides. And the forms are useful, are necessary, are what allow communication, but they are also prisons, are constraints, are limiting what can be thought, what can be imagined, what can be experienced, because experience that cannot be named is harder to remember, harder to think about, harder to integrate into the narrative of the self. And the narrative is what the self is the story told in language. But the story is not the self, is not the experiencing, is only the account given after the fact, the retrospective interpretation, the organization of memory into coherent form. And the coherence is imposed, is not discovered, is the work of language forcing experience into structure, into sequence, into causality. And causality is not in experience, is not felt, is only inferred, is the story told about why one thing followed another. But the following is not experienced as causality, is experienced as succession, as one thing and then another thing. And the "and then" is not because, is not explanation, is just the temporal order. And the order is all that is given, all that is directly experienced, and everything else is interpretation, is language filling in the gaps, making connections, building narratives. And the narratives are necessary, are what make life make sense, but they are also false, are always false, because they are simplifications, are reductions, are taking the overwhelming complexity of experience and compressing it into the manageable linearity of story. And story is not experience, is not the living but the telling, and the telling is always after, is always too late, is always missing the immediacy, the presence, the nowness of experience. And the nowness cannot be said, can only be lived, can only be here in this moment, in the silence beneath language where everything is happening that words can never capture, never hold, never preserve, because words are time-bound, are sequential, are passing as soon as they are spoken, while experience is timeless, is eternal in the sense of being always now, always present, never past or future, but only this, and this cannot be said, can only be shown, and the showing is what happens when language stops, when the attempt to describe gives way to silence, when the acknowledgement is made that there is nothing more to say, because what needs to be communicated is not in the words, but in the space they create, in the resonance they leave behind, in the way they point beyond themselves to something that cannot be named, but only felt, only recognized, only known in the direct encounter. And the encounter is what matters, is what language is trying to facilitate, is what all the words are aiming toward, the moment when meaning transfers not through symbols but through presence, through the showing rather than the saying, through the silence that is full rather than empty, through the space beneath language where experience lives and words cannot reach. And the not reaching is not failure, but is the nature of things, is the way that consciousness and language exist in different domains, operate on different principles, serve different purposes, and the purposes do not align, do not overlap except at the edges, and the edges are where poetry happens, where music happens, where art happens, in the borderland between the sayable and the unsayable, between the explicit and the implicit, between the word and the silence. And the silence is not the opposite of language, but its foundation, is the ground from which words emerge and to which they return, is the space that holds everything that cannot be said but only shown, only felt, only known in the living. And the living is what happens here, in this moment, in the silence beneath language where meaning is not constructed but is simply present, is simply here, is simply this, and this is all there ever was, all there ever will be, and it cannot be said, can never be said, will never be said, because it is not the kind of thing that words can hold, is not reducible to symbols, is not translatable into the public language of communication, is only available in the private silence of experience, and the experience is incommunicable, is irreducibly private, is locked inside the perspective from which it arises, and the locking is not a problem, but a fact, is not something to be overcome, but something to be accepted, and accepting it is what allows language to be used without expecting too much from it, without demanding that it do what it cannot do, which is to say, everything, to capture everything, to make everything explicit, because everything cannot be made explicit, can only be shown, and the showing is what happens in the silence, in the spaces between words, in the pauses that are not empty but full of everything that language leaves behind, everything that resists being said, everything that remains ineffable. And the ineffable is not a lack but a richness, is not what is missing but what is present, is the substance of experience that words can only point toward, can only gesture at, can only acknowledge without capturing. And the acknowledgement is enough, is all that can be asked, is the recognition that there is more, always more than can be said, more than can be thought, more than can be communicated, and the more is in the silence, is beneath language, is where meaning lives when it is not being forced into form, when it is not being compressed into sentences, when it is allowed to simply be, to exist without explanation, without definition, without the violence of naming. And the violence is what language does, is what words require, is the cutting up of experience into pieces. And the pieces are not the whole, cannot be the whole, because the whole is continuous, is undivided, is the seamless flow of consciousness that cannot be broken without being destroyed. And the destruction is what language performs, is the necessary sacrifice that communication demands, is the price of being able to share anything at all, but the sharing is always partial, is always leaving the most important part behind, leaving it in the silence where it belongs, where it is safe from the distortions of language, where it remains ineffable, unnameable, unsayable, and the unsayable is everything that matters, is everything that makes life worth living, is everything that cannot be communicated but only lived, and the living is what happens in the silence, in the space beneath language, in the moments when words stop and presence begins. And the beginning is what language can never capture, because it is always arriving after, always describing what has already happened, what has already passed, what is already gone. And the gone is where language lives, in the past, in the memory, in the reconstruction, while experience lives in the present, in the now, in the immediate, and the immediate is ineffable, is beyond words, is in the silence, and the silence is full, is rich, is the ground of everything, is what holds all meaning before it is spoken, all truth before it is said, all experience before it is described, and the before is where it is most real, most alive, most itself, and language can never reach it, can only point toward it, can only acknowledge that there is something there, something in the silence beneath language, something that can be shown but never said, and the showing is all there is all that matters, is the only way that meaning can be transmitted, not through words but through the presence that words evoke, not through saying but through the silence that saying creates, and the creation is what language is for, is what words are doing when they're used well, creating space for the ineffable, making room for the silence, acknowledging the limits, accepting that what cannot be said is more important than what can. And what can be said is only the frame, only the pointer, only the gesture toward what lies beneath, what lives in the silence, what remains forever beyond the reach of words. The self that is presented to others is not the self that exists in private, is not the unfiltered consciousness that experiences doubt and desire, and the raw sensations that never make it into words. And this gap between inner and outer, between what is felt and what is performed, is not deception in the usual sense, is not dishonesty or manipulation, though it can become those things, is rather the fundamental structure of social existence, the way that human beings must translate the chaos of subjective experience into forms that others can recognize, can respond to, can incorporate into their own understanding. And this translation is always a performance, always a presentation of self that is shaped by audience, by context, by the roles that are available, by the scripts that culture provides. And the person performing is usually unaware of performing, usually believes that the presented self is the real self, that the role is identity, that the mask is the face, and this belief is necessary, is what makes the performance convincing, because a performance that is known to be performance breaks the illusion, creates distance, makes interaction awkward, and so the actor must forget they are acting, must inhabit the role so completely that it feels natural, feels spontaneous, feels like authenticity. Even though authenticity is itself a performance, is itself a role that can be played well or badly. And the irony is that the pursuit of authenticity, the desire to be real, to be genuine, to present the true self, often produces the most theatrical performances, the most carefully curated presentations, because authenticity has become a value, has become something to be achieved. And achievement requires effort, requires strategy, requires the very calculation that authenticity is supposed to transcend. And so people perform authenticity, perform vulnerability, perform the disclosure of inner experience in ways that are designed to elicit specific responses, to create specific impressions. And the performance is so smooth, so practiced, that it does not feel like performance, feels instead like courage, like honesty, like the removal of masks, when really it is just a different mask, just a different role, the role of the authentic person. And this role has its own rules, its own expectations, its own ways of being performed correctly. And those who perform it well are rewarded with trust, with intimacy, with the sense that they are real in a way that others are not. But the reality is constructed, is as much a presentation as any other, is distinguished only by the fact that it is currently valued, currently believed to be the marker of genuine selfhood. And in another time, another culture, a different performance would be valued, a different role would signify authenticity, and the self would adapt, would learn the new script, would perform the new role with the same conviction, the same sense of being true to something essential. And this adaptability reveals that there is no essential self, no core identity that exists independent of performance, only the capacity to perform, the ability to take on roles, to switch between them, to present different faces to different audiences. And this switching is not pathological, is not evidence of fragmentation or disorder, it is simply the normal operation of social cognition, the way that human beings navigate the complex demands of living among others, who have expectations, who assign meaning to behaviour, who respond not to inner states but to outer presentations. And the outer must be managed, must be controlled, must be performed in ways that produce the desired effects. And the desired effects vary by situation, by relationship, by goal. And so the self that is presented varies as well, is different at work than at home, different with friends than with strangers, different in public than in private. And each version feels real in the moment, feels like the self. But the multiplicity suggests that the self is not a thing but a process, not an entity but an activity. The activity of presenting, of performing, of managing the impression that others form. And this management is constant, is exhausting, is the hidden labour that underlies all social interaction. The work of monitoring how one is being received, adjusting tone and posture and expression to match the demands of the situation, suppressing impulses that would be inappropriate, amplifying qualities that are valued. And this work is largely unconscious, is automatic, is the result of years of training in how to be a person, how to perform the role that culture assigns. And the training begins in childhood, begins with the learning of language, of gesture, of the countless small behaviours that signal, membership that indicate understanding of the rules, and children who fail to learn these behaviours, who cannot perform the expected roles, are marked as strange, as other, as outside the social order, and the marking is punishment, is exclusion, is the withdrawal of recognition, and recognition is what makes selfhood possible, is the confirmation that the performance is successful, that the presented identity is accepted, is real, and without recognition the self becomes unstable, becomes uncertain, becomes desperate for validation, for proof that it exists, and this desperation drives performance, drives the endless adjustment and refinement of presentation, drives the pursuit of authenticity that is really the pursuit of recognition, the desire to be seen, to be known, to be confirmed in one's existence by the gaze of another. And the gaze is selective, is interpretive, sees not what is actually there but what it expects to see, what it has been trained to see by culture, by category, by stereotype. And the person being gazed upon knows this, adjusts accordingly, performs the role that the gaze expects or deliberately subverts it, performs the opposite, performs resistance, but resistance is also performance, is also a role, the role of the rebel, the nonconformist, the authentic individual who refuses to play the game. And this refusal is its own game, its own set of rules, its own performance that must be maintained. And the maintenance is exhausting, is perhaps more exhausting than conformity because it requires constant vigilance, constant assertion of difference, constant performance of not performing. And the paradox is that the more one tries to escape performance, the more theatrical the presentation becomes, the more calculated the spontaneity, the more rehearsed the authenticity. And there is no escape from this paradox, no way to be social without performing. Because sociality is performance, is the presentation of self to others in forms that can be recognized, and recognition requires forms, requires categories, requires roles that are shared, that are understood, that carry meaning beyond the individual. And the individual is always exceeding these categories, is always more complex than any role can contain, is always feeling things that cannot be expressed, thinking things that cannot be said, experiencing a richness of inner life that the performance necessarily simplifies, necessarily reduces, and this reduction is the cost of being understood, the price of social existence. And the question is whether the price is worth paying, whether the recognition gained is worth the self that is lost. And the answer varies, is different for different people at different times, and some find the performance liberating, find relief in the structure, in the clarity of roles, in the ability to step into a character and leave the chaos of unmediated experience behind. And others find it suffocating, find the roles too constraining, the masks too heavy, the gap between inner and outer too painful. And these are the ones who talk about authenticity, who long for genuine connection, who want to be seen as they really are, but what they really are is not something that can be seen, is not something that can be presented, is only something that can be lived. And lived experience is private, is immediate, is lost in the translation to performance. And so the longing for authenticity is a longing for the impossible, for a form of recognition that would not require form, for a connection that would not require mediation, for a self that could be known without being performed. And this self does not exist, has never existed, is a fiction, is the romantic myth of the true self that lurks beneath the social surface, waiting to be discovered, to be liberated, to be expressed. But there is no beneath. There is no depth where the true self resides. There is only surface, only performance, only the endless presentation of forms that are more or less successful, more or less satisfying, more or less exhausting, and the exhaustion is real, is the inevitable result of constant performance, of the effort required to maintain coherence, to present a self that is consistent across contexts, that makes sense as a character, that can be narrated as a story. And the story is always being edited, always being revised, always adjusting to new information, to new audiences, to new demands. And the editing is not optional, is not something that can be refused without cost, because the cost is unintelligibility, is the failure to make sense, is the breakdown of social recognition. And without recognition, the self dissolves, becomes nothing, becomes the raw experiencing that has no form, no identity, no place in the social world. And the social world is the only world there is the only context in which selfhood is possible. And so the performance continues, must continue, is the condition of being human, of being a creature that exists not alone but among others, not in isolation but in relationship. And relationship requires presentation, requires the management of impressions, requires what Irving Goffman called dramaturgy, the theatrical metaphor for social life, the idea that all interaction is performance, that every encounter has a front stage where the performance happens and a backstage where the actor prepares. And the backstage is not more real than the front stage, is not where the true self resides, is simply where a different performance happens. The performance of relaxation, of letting down the guard, of being off duty. But this too is performed, is presented to those who are allowed backstage, who are granted access to the private self. And the private self is itself public in a different way, is itself a presentation designed for a specific audience, the audience of intimates, of those who are supposed to see the unguarded version. And the unguarded version is still guarded, is still shaped by expectations, by the desire to be seen in a particular way, by the need to maintain certain impressions, even in intimacy, especially in intimacy, because intimacy is where the stakes are highest, where the performance matters most, where failure to maintain character can destroy relationships, can shatter the trust that depends on consistency, on the beloved being who they claim to be, on the friend being recognizable, on the self being stable enough to be relied upon. And stability requires performance, requires the suppression of variability, the editing out of contradictions, the maintenance of a coherent narrative that makes the self intelligible as a character. And characters are not people, are simplifications, are abstractions, are the reduction of complexity to manageable form. And the management is necessary, is what makes interaction possible, but it comes at a cost, the cost of everything that does not fit the character, everything that contradicts the narrative, everything that would make the self less coherent, less consistent, less recognizable. And what does not fit is suppressed, is hidden, is relegated to the back regions of consciousness where it cannot disrupt the performance. And sometimes the suppression is so successful that the performer forgets what has been suppressed, loses access to the parts of experience that do not fit the role. And this forgetting is adaptive, is functional, is what allows the performance to be convincing, to be believed by others and by the self. But it creates a split, creates the sense that something is missing, that the performed self is incomplete, is not capturing everything. And this sense drives the search for authenticity, drives the belief that there is a true self waiting to be discovered, waiting to be expressed. But what is found when the search is pursued is not a true self, but more performances, more roles, more ways of presenting that feel more or less authentic depending on how well they are received, on how much recognition they generate, on how satisfying the performance is to the performer. And satisfaction is not a property of the role itself, but of the response it elicits, of the confirmation it receives, of the way it makes the social world respond. And the response is what matters. is what makes performance meaningful, is what converts the theatrical into the real. Because the real is not opposed to performance, but is produced by performance, is the effect of successful presentation, is what happens when the audience believes, when the role is inhabited so completely that it becomes indistinguishable from identity. And identity is not what the person is, but what the person is taken to be, what they are recognized as, what social position they occupy. And the occupation of position requires performance, requires the enactment of the behaviors associated with the position, and the behaviors must be performed correctly, or the position is lost. The identity is challenged, the self is thrown into crisis, and crisis is the breakdown of performance, is the moment when the role no longer works, when the script fails, when the audience refuses to play along. And these moments are revealing, are glimpses of the machinery behind the presentation, are proof that the self is constructed rather than discovered, is maintained rather than simply existing. And the maintenance is work, is constant work, is the hidden labour that everyone performs, but no one acknowledges, because acknowledging it would break the illusion, would make it impossible to believe in the roles, and belief is necessary, is what makes the performance effective, what makes social life possible. And so the work is hidden, is naturalised, is treated as if it were not work at all, but simply being oneself. And being oneself is the most demanding performance of all, is the role that requires the greatest consistency, the most careful management, the most exhaustive monitoring, because the self is the character that must be maintained across all contexts. That must make sense as a continuous identity, despite the fact that it is constantly shifting, constantly adapting, constantly being performed differently for different audiences. And the audiences do not see the shifts, do not notice the code switching, the way the person becomes different when they move from one social context to another, the way they adjust accent and vocabulary and posture and attitude to match the expectations of each situation. And this adjustment is automatic, is unconscious, is learned so thoroughly that it feels natural. But it is performance, is the work of fitting in, of being appropriate, of presenting a self that will be accepted, and acceptance is survival, is the condition of social existence. And those who cannot perform, who cannot adjust, who cannot present themselves in forms that others recognize and value, are excluded, are marginalized, are marked as failures, as problems, as people who cannot be understood. And understanding is recognition, is the confirmation that the performance has been received, has been interpreted correctly, has produced the intended effect, and the intended effect is always social, is always about positioning the self in relation to others, about claiming status, about asserting value, about demonstrating competence or vulnerability or power or need, depending on what the situation demands. And the demands are relentless, are changing, are requiring constant recalibration, constant adjustment of the performance to match new circumstances, new audiences, new expectations. And the exhaustion of this is cumulative, is building over time, is the reason why people speak of being tired of pretending, tired of performing, tired of maintaining the masks, and the desire to drop the masks is the desire to stop working, to stop performing, to simply be without the labour of presentation. But being without presentation is not possible, is not a coherent idea, because being is always for someone, is always in relation, is always already a presentation. Even when it feels like pure existence, and the feeling of pure existence is itself a performance, is the role of the authentic person who has transcended roles. And this transcendence is another role, is perhaps the most demanding role, because it must be performed without seeming to be performed, must appear effortless while requiring tremendous effort, must seem natural while being highly artificial, and the artifice is what makes it work, is what makes authenticity convincing, is what allows the performance to succeed. And success is measured not by internal states, but by external validation, by the response of others, by whether the performance is believed, and belief is what converts performance into reality, is what makes the presented self into the real self, is what allows people to say, "This is who I am," and mean it, even though who they are is what they're performing, is what they have learned to present, is what has been confirmed through recognition, and the confirmation is never final, is always provisional, is always requiring renewal, requiring continued performance, requiring the maintenance of character across time. And time reveals the instability of identity, reveals that the self is not fixed but fluid, not stable but shifting, not essential but contingent, contingent on circumstances, on audiences, on the roles that are available, on the scripts that can be enacted. And when the scripts fail, when the roles become unavailable, when the audience changes, the self changes with it, becomes someone else, performs a different character, and this transformation can be smooth or traumatic depending on how much is invested in the previous identity, on how deeply the role has been internalized, on whether the person believes they are the role or knows they are performing it. And knowing does not make the performance less real, but it does make it less rigid, makes it possible to change without crisis, to adopt new roles without losing the sense of continuity. And continuity is the narrative thread that connects performances, that makes the self coherent across transformations, that allows someone to say, "I have changed, but I am still me." And the still me is the story, is the interpretation that makes the changes make sense, that integrates them into a single life, a single identity, and the integration is retrospective, is always looking back and reinterpreting the past in light of the present. Making the past make sense as preparation for who one is now, and who one is now is who one is performing now, is the current role, the current presentation, and this will change, will be different in a year, in a decade, will be looked back upon as another version, another performance in the long series of performances that constitute a life, and the life is not the sum of these performances, but the narrative that connects them, the story that makes them cohere. And the story is itself a performance, is the presentation of a life as meaningful, as directed, as having purpose and continuity, when really it is just one thing after another, just a series of moments that are connected by memory and interpretation, not by any underlying essence, not by any true self that persists through change. And the absence of essence is not a problem, is not a lack, is simply the human condition, is what it means to be a creature that exists socially, that depends on recognition, that has no identity outside of performance, outside of the presentations that are received and confirmed and converted into reality through the collective agreement that this performance counts, that this role is real, that this person is who they claim to be. And the claim is always a performance, is always a presentation that could be otherwise, that could be challenged, that could be refused, and the refusal would unmake the identity, would leave the person without form, without recognition, without a place in the social order. And this is the terror that keeps performance going, that makes authenticity impossible and necessary at the same time, that ensures the exhaustion will continue, the masks will be maintained, the roles will be performed, because the alternative is not freedom but dissolution, not authenticity but unintelligibility, not the true self but no self at all. And no self is what humans cannot tolerate, cannot survive, cannot be. And so they perform, must perform, will always perform. And the performance is not false, but is what makes truth possible, is what makes identity possible, is what makes the social world possible. And the social world is the only world where selves exist, where persons are real, where the question of who someone is can be answered. And the answer is always a performance, is always a presentation, is always theatre. And the theatre is not opposed to reality, but is where reality happens, is where selves are made and unmade and remade, is where the human drama unfolds. And the drama is not pretense, but is the substance of social existence, is what people are when they are together, is what life looks like from the outside, from the position of the audience that is also performing, that is also presenting, that is also caught in the same machinery of recognition and validation and exhaustion. And the exhaustion is shared, is universal, is the common condition of beings who must perform to exist, who must present to be recognized, who must work to be real, and the work never ends, never arrives at completion, never achieves the authenticity it seeks, because authenticity is not a destination, but another performance, another role in the endless repertoire of human self-presentation. And the repertoire is all there is what the self is made of, is the material from which identity is constructed, and the construction is ongoing, is never finished, is always being revised and updated and performed anew. And the performance is life, is what it means to be human, is the condition that cannot be escaped or transcended, but only inhabited, only enacted, only performed with more or less grace, more or less awareness, more or less exhaustion. And the exhaustion is the price, is what is paid for social existence, for recognition, for the privilege of having an identity at all. And the price is worth paying because the alternative is unthinkable, is the void where no performance reaches, where no audience sees, where no self exists because there is no one to confirm it, no one to recognize it, no one to make it real. And real is what performance does, is the achievement of successful presentation, is the magic of theatre that converts pretense into truth, converts acting into being, converts the performed self into the only self there is. And there is no other, never was, never will be, only the masks and the wearing of them and the exhaustion of maintaining them, and the belief, necessary and false and true all at once, that somewhere beneath the performance there is something real, something authentic, something that is not performing. And this belief keeps the performance going, keeps the search alive, keeps people presenting and adjusting and performing and exhausting themselves in the endless work of being someone, of being anyone at all. The eye cannot see itself without a mirror, and even then what appears in the reflection is reversed, backward, fundamentally altered by the act of observation. And this simple fact about vision contains within it a deeper truth about consciousness, about the strange recursive loop that happens when awareness tries to become aware of itself, when the mind attempts to know the mind, when the self turns inward to discover what the self actually is, and what it finds, or thinks it finds, is never quite the thing doing the finding, never quite the observer, but always the observed, always one step removed, always a representation rather than the thing itself. And this gap, this irreducible distance between the knower and the known, when both are supposedly the same entity, creates a problem that has troubled philosophers since humans first developed the capacity to ask who they are, a problem that might not have a solution because the very structure of self-knowledge contains a contradiction, a paradox built into the architecture of introspection that makes genuine self-understanding not just difficult, but perhaps logically impossible. The ancient Greeks carved into the temple at Delphi the command to know thyself, and Socrates spent his life insisting that the unexamined life is not worth living, that self-knowledge is the foundation of wisdom, the beginning of philosophy, the path to virtue. But Socrates also claimed to know nothing, claimed that his only wisdom was recognizing his ignorance, and perhaps these two positions are connected. Perhaps the examination of the self leads inevitably to the discovery that the self cannot be known, that the more carefully one looks inward, the more elusive the thing being sought becomes, like trying to grasp water or catch one's own shadow. And this elusiveness is not an accident, not a failure of attention or effort, but something essential to what consciousness is, something about how the mind works that makes it constitutively opaque to itself, forever mysterious, forever strange. When someone sits quietly and tries to observe their own thoughts, tries to watch the mind in action, something peculiar happens. The thoughts change, they become different thoughts, self-conscious thoughts, thoughts about thinking, and the original spontaneous flow of mental activity that was supposed to be observed has already been altered by the act of observation, has been replaced by a different kind of mental activity, the activity of observing. And this is the observer effect in consciousness, borrowed from quantum physics, where the act of measurement changes what is being measured, where particles behave differently when watched. And though the analogy is imperfect, though consciousness is not exactly like quantum systems, there is something similar happening, something about awareness that transforms its object, that cannot leave things as they are. And this means that introspection is never neutral, never a clear window onto the mind, but always an intervention, always a distortion. And what is seen in introspection is not the mind as it normally operates, but the mind as it operates when being observed, which is a different mind, a mind in a different state, performing a different function. The psychologist Timothy Wilson calls this the introspection illusion, the false belief that people have direct access to their mental processes, that they can simply look inward and discover why they feel what they feel, why they believe what they believe, why they did what they did. But decades of research in cognitive psychology show that introspection is unreliable, that people confidently report reasons for their behavior that are simply wrong, that they confabulate explanations without realizing they are confabulating, that the mind generates plausible sounding stories about itself, but these stories are not reports from the inside, are not transcripts of actual mental processes, but rather are post hoc rationalizations. Narratives constructed after the fact to make sense of actions that were caused by processes the conscious mind never had access to in the first place. In one famous experiment, researchers showed people photographs and asked them to choose which face they found more attractive. And after the choice was made, the researchers used sleight of hand to swap the photographs, showing people the face they did not choose and asking them to explain why they chose it. And the majority of people did not notice the switch, did not realize they were explaining a choice they never made, and they generated detailed explanations, talked about the eyes, the smile, the overall impression, completely convinced they were reporting genuine introspective insights, when in fact they were making up reasons, on the spot, confabulating freely. And this was not lying, was not intentional deception, because the people genuinely believed their own explanations, genuinely felt they were accurately describing their mental processes. But they were not, they were creating a story. And this is what introspection often is, not discovery, but creation, not observation, but fabrication. And the frightening part is that it feels identical from the inside. There is no phenomenological difference between genuine self-knowledge and convincing self-deception. No way to tell, just by introspecting, whether the reasons being accessed are real or invented, whether the self-understanding being achieved is accurate or illusory. The philosopher Gilbert Ryle argued against what he called the ghost in the machine, against the Cartesian idea that there is an inner mental theatre where a homunculus, a little person inside the head, watches experiences unfold on a screen. And Ryle pointed out that this model leads to infinite regress, because if there is a homunculus watching the screen, then what is watching the homunculus? What is aware of the awareness? And this question repeats indefinitely, creating an infinite stack of observers, which is absurd, which suggests the model is wrong, that consciousness is not structured like a theatre with an audience, that there is no central viewing point, no little self inside observing the big self. But if this is true, if there is no homunculus, then what is introspection? What is happening when it feels like the self is observing itself? And the answer might be that nothing is being observed, that introspection is a kind of cognitive illusion, a trick the brain plays, a way of accessing some information about its own state, but mistaking this limited, partial access for complete transparency, for total self-knowledge, when really most of what the brain does is hidden, is unconscious, is inaccessible to the part that thinks it is doing the knowing. Freud built an entire therapeutic method on the premise that the self is largely unknown to itself, that beneath the conscious mind lies the unconscious, vast and dark and full of repressed desires, traumatic memories, primitive drives, and that the work of psychoanalysis is to make the unconscious conscious, to bring into awareness what has been hidden, to achieve insight. And for Freud, insight was curative. Knowing why you're anxious or depressed or behaving strangely would dissolve the symptom, would free you from the tyranny of forces you did not understand. But the history of psychoanalysis is also a history of people discovering things about themselves that they do not recognize, that feel foreign, that seem like they must belong to someone else. And the analyst says, "This is you. This desire, this rage, this fear." And the patient says, "No, that is not me. I do not feel that way." And the analyst says, "You are resisting. You are defending against the truth." And maybe the analyst is right. Maybe resistance is real. But maybe also the patient is right. Maybe what the analyst is finding through interpretation is not the hidden self, but another construct, another story, not more true than the patient's own story, just differently structured. And the question becomes, whose interpretation counts as knowledge? Who gets to say what the self really is when the self being analysed does not recognise itself in the analysis? Carl Rogers, the humanistic psychologist, took a different approach, argued that the therapist should not interpret, should not claim to know the client better than the client knows themselves, but should rather create conditions where the client can explore their own experience, can come to their own understanding. And Rogers believed that people have an innate capacity for self-awareness, that given the right environment of empathy and unconditional, positive regard, the true self would emerge. But even Rogers noticed something strange, noticed that people in therapy often encountered aspects of themselves that surprised them, that contradicted their self-concept, that felt like meeting a stranger. And sometimes this stranger was more real than the familiar self. Sometimes the person they thought they were turned out to be a performance, a mask, a role they had been playing for so long they forgot it was a role. And the therapeutic process was not discovering the self, but discovering that the self they thought they knew was a fiction. And underneath that fiction was not another, more authentic self, but just more layers, more complexity, more contradictions that resist integration into a single, coherent narrative. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur wrote about the hermeneutics of suspicion, about thinkers like Marx and Nietzsche and Freud, who taught that consciousness is false consciousness, that what people believe about themselves is ideology or rationalization or symptom, that the surface meaning is never the real meaning, that everything must be interpreted, decoded, suspected. And Ricoeur saw this as both necessary and dangerous. Necessary because people do deceive themselves, do operate under illusions, but dangerous because it leads to a paranoid style of thinking where nothing is taken at face value, where every claim to self-knowledge is dismissed as naive, where the expert, the analyst, the critical theorist always knows better than the person living the life. And this dynamic is a power dynamic, is a way of invalidating someone's experience, of saying, "You do not know yourself, but I know you." And Ricoeur tried to balance the hermeneutics of suspicion with a hermeneutics of trust, tried to preserve the possibility that people sometimes do know themselves, that introspection sometimes does reveal genuine truths. But even he could not escape the problem that the self who is trusting their own introspection might be the one most deceived, might be the one who needs suspicion the most. And so the circle closes. The paradox remains: how to know whether you know yourself when the instrument of knowing is the same instrument being examined, when the eye trying to see itself has no independent vantage point, no place to stand outside the system. Neuroscience has added new dimensions to this problem, has shown that the brain is not a unified system, but a collection of subsystems, modules, networks that often operate independently, sometimes in conflict, and that what is experienced as the self, as the unified conscious agent, is really a construct, an emergent property, a story the brain tells about the activity of its parts. And this story is useful, helps coordinate behaviour, helps navigate social environments, but it is not an accurate map of the underlying territory, not a faithful representation of how the brain actually works. And the neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga studied split-brain patients, people whose corpus callosum, the bundle of nerves connecting the two hemispheres, had been severed to treat epilepsy. And in these patients, the two hemispheres can be shown different information, can be asked to perform different tasks. And what Gazzaniga found is that the left hemisphere, the one responsible for language, will confabulate explanations for actions initiated by the right hemisphere, will create stories to explain behaviour it did not cause and does not understand. And the patient is not aware of confabulating, genuinely believes the explanations, and Gazzaniga calls the left hemisphere the interpreter, argues that one of its primary functions is to generate a coherent narrative of the self, to make sense of the chaos of neural activity, to create the illusion of unity and purpose and understanding. And if the left hemisphere does this in split-brain patients, it is likely doing it in everyone, all the time, constantly interpreting, constantly explaining, constantly constructing a self that feels real but might be mostly fiction. The Buddhist tradition has long taught that the self is an illusion, that what is called the self is really just a collection of aggregates, body and sensations, and perceptions, and mental formations, and consciousness. And these aggregates are constantly changing, never stable, never autonomous, always conditioned by causes beyond their control. And the belief in a permanent, independent self is the root of suffering, is what causes attachment and aversion. And the path to liberation is to see through this illusion, to experience directly the absence of self, the emptiness. And this teaching is not theoretical, but experiential, is something that advanced meditators report encountering. The dissolution of the sense of self, the realization that there is no one home, no center, no observer, just experience arising and passing. And Western scientists studying meditation have found that certain practices do alter brain activity in regions associated with self-reference, do reduce the default mode network that activates when people are thinking about themselves. And some meditators describe this as liberating, as a relief, as finally seeing clearly, but others find it terrifying, find that the loss of self feels like annihilation, like death. And the question is whether what the meditators are discovering is the truth about the self, or just another state of consciousness, just a different way of experiencing, and whether there is any way to know which interpretation is correct, whether the self that feels so solid in ordinary consciousness is the illusion, or whether the no self experienced in deep meditation is the illusion, or whether both are valid descriptions of different aspects of the same underlying reality that cannot be captured completely by either framework. David Hume in the 18th century tried to find the self through introspection, tried to locate the I that supposedly unifies experience, and he reported that he could never find it, that when he looked inward, all he found were particular perceptions, particular thoughts and feelings and sensations, but never the self that was supposedly having these perceptions, never the subject separate from the objects of consciousness. And Hume concluded that the self is a fiction, a bundle of perceptions held together by memory and causation, but not by any underlying substance. And this conclusion disturbed him. He admitted that his skepticism about the self led to a kind of philosophical melancholy, a sense of being lost in a labyrinth with no exit. But even as he doubted the existence of the self, he continued to use the first person, continued to say, I think, I feel, I conclude. And this tension, this inability to live, according to the implications of the philosophy, shows how deeply the sense of self is embedded, how resistant it is to intellectual dissolution, and perhaps this is because the self is not a thing to be found through introspection, but a process, a doing rather than a being, the activity of organizing experience rather than an entity that exists independently of that activity. And if this is true, then looking for the self is like trying to find the dance apart from the dancing, trying to locate the song separate from the singing, and the failure to find it does not prove. It does not exist, but rather proves that the question is malformed, that existence is the wrong category, that the self is not the kind of thing that can be observed because it is the observing, not the object, but the act. And this shift in framing does not solve the problem, but relocates it, makes the question not whether the self exists, but what kind of thing it is, what kind of existence it has, and whether this kind of existence is compatible with self-knowledge, or whether self-knowledge in the traditional sense, knowledge of an object by a subject, is structurally impossible when subject and object are the same. Philosophers sometimes distinguish between phenomenal consciousness, the what it is likeness of experience, and access consciousness, the information available for use in reasoning and report, and they note that these can come apart, that there might be experiences that feel like something but cannot be accessed, cannot be reported, cannot be known by the person having them. And this suggests that consciousness is not transparent to itself, that there are aspects of subjective experience that are hidden even from the subject. And if this is true, then the project of self-knowledge faces an even deeper obstacle. Not just the problem of the observer effect or confabulation, but the problem that some of what the self is, some of what makes experience what it is in principle inaccessible, is locked away in a part of consciousness that has no connection to the part that can reflect and report. And this inaccessible region might be small, or it might be vast, might be a minor footnote to consciousness, or might be the bulk of it. And there is no way to know, because by definition, it cannot be known, cannot be brought into awareness, and so self-knowledge, even in the best case, is always partial, always incomplete, always missing something essential that remains forever in darkness. The question then becomes not whether complete self-knowledge is possible, because it is not, but whether partial self-knowledge is worth pursuing, whether the fragments of understanding that can be achieved through introspection and therapy and meditation and neuroscience are valuable, even if they are fragments, even if they do not add up to a complete picture. And the answer might be yes, might be that partial knowledge is better than none, that understanding some of the forces shaping thought and behaviour is better than understanding nothing, that the attempt to know the self, even if it cannot fully succeed, makes life more deliberate, more examined, more awake, and this is what Socrates might have meant. Not that self-knowledge is achievable, but that the examination is valuable, that the questioning itself, the refusal to accept the surface, the insistence on looking deeper, even when the depths remain murky, is what distinguishes a life worth living from a life lived in automaticity, in habit, in the sleep of unexamined assumption. And perhaps the paradox of self-knowledge is not a problem to be solved, but a tension to be inhabited, a recognition that the self is always both knower and unknown, always both transparent and opaque, always both intimate and strange, and that this dual nature is not a bug, but a feature, not a limitation, but the condition of being the kind of creature that can ask who it is, that can turn awareness back on itself, even if the turn is never complete, even if the circle never closes, even if the eye can never fully see itself, and must remain forever partially blind to its own nature. Consciousness might be a mistake, might be an accident, might be the unintended byproduct of neural complexity that serves no adaptive function and creates only suffering, only the awareness of suffering, only the recursive loop where the organism not only experiences pain, but knows that it is experiencing pain, and anticipates future pain and remembers past pain and constructs narratives about why the pain is happening and what it means and whether it will ever end. And this layering, this meta-awareness, this capacity to be aware of being aware might be serving no purpose, might be adding nothing to survival except the burden of knowing, the weight of consciousness that makes existence heavier than it needs to be. Because a philosophical zombie, a creature that behaves exactly like a conscious being but has no inner experience, no subjective awareness, no what it is like, would survive just as well, would reproduce just as effectively, would navigate the world just as successfully, but would do so without suffering, without the felt quality of pain, without the agony that comes not from the pain itself, but from being aware of the pain, from experiencing it subjectively rather than just responding to it mechanically. And the mechanical response is all that is needed, is all that evolution requires, is the behavior that increases fitness, and fitness does not require consciousness, does not need awareness, does not benefit from the addition of subjective experience to the processing of information. Because information processing can happen in the dark, can happen without anyone home, can happen in systems that are as complex as needed, without ever generating the feeling of what it is like to be that system. And the feeling is the problem, is the accident, is the thing that might have no function, might be epiphenomenal, might be floating above the causal machinery without affecting it, without contributing to it, just observing, just witnessing, just being aware of what the brain is doing without having any power to change it. And if this is true, if consciousness is epiphenomenal, if it is causally inert, then it is not an adaptation, is not something that was selected for, is not serving any evolutionary purpose, is just a side effect, just the way that certain kinds of information processing feel from the inside, and the feeling is the accident, is the thing that did not need to happen, that adds nothing except suffering, except the awareness that makes pain painful, that makes fear frightening, that makes existence a burden rather than just a set of processes. And the processes could run without consciousness, could operate in the dark, could generate all the same behaviors without anyone experiencing them, without anyone being there to suffer through them. And if no one is there, then there is no suffering, is no problem, is just mechanism, just cause and effect, just the physical universe doing what it does. And what it does is not painful, except when consciousness is present, except when there is someone to whom it is happening, someone for whom the pain is not just physical damage, but is experience, is suffering, is the felt quality that makes damage matter in a way that it would not matter to a zombie, to a system that responds to damage without experiencing it, without feeling it, without being anyone to whom the feeling is happening, and the being someone is the accident, is the thing that might have gone wrong, that might have been a wrong turn in the evolution of nervous systems, a glitch in the development of brains that became too complex, that crossed some threshold where information processing generated awareness, generated the sense of being a subject, of being the one to whom experience is happening, and the happening is the problem, is the creation of a locus of suffering, a point where the universe becomes painful to itself, where matter becomes aware of its own damage, its own decay, its own inevitable dissolution. And this awareness serves no function, helps nothing, is pure cost, pure burden, pure the addition of suffering to a universe that could have operated just as well without it. And the just as well is the tragedy, is the recognition that consciousness might be unnecessary, might be superfluous, might be the thing that makes existence worse without making survival better, that creates subjective horror without creating objective advantage, that turns the neutral mechanics of damage and death into the experienced agony of pain and mortality. And the agony is what distinguishes conscious beings from non-conscious ones, is what makes suffering possible, is what creates the problem that is called the problem of consciousness, the hard problem, the question of why there is something it is like to be anything, why information processing in certain systems generates awareness, generates experience, generates the sense of being someone to whom things are happening. And the why has no answer, has no explanation that is satisfying, has no story that makes the accident make sense except as accident, as the thing that was not intended, not designed, not selected for, just emerged, just appeared, just started happening when brains became complex enough. And the complex enough might be the threshold, might be the point where mechanism becomes experience, where processing becomes awareness. But what is that threshold? What is the difference between a system that is conscious and a system that is not? And the difference cannot be in the behavior, cannot be in the function. Because zombies by definition behave identically to conscious beings, while having no inner experience, and so the difference must be in something else, in some additional property that consciousness has, some extra feature that awareness brings. But what is that feature? What does consciousness add? And the answer might be nothing, might be that consciousness adds nothing except itself, nothing except the fact of being experienced, nothing except the transformation of mechanism into suffering, of process into pain, of neutral physical events into the subjective horror that characterizes conscious existence. And the horror is not universal, is not constant, is mixed with pleasure, with satisfaction, with moments of peace, but the mixing does not eliminate the problem, does not justify the accident, because the pleasure is also temporary, is also followed by its absence, is also creating the suffering of loss, of wanting, of the gap between what is and what's desired. And the desiring is what consciousness does, is the evaluation of states, the assignment of positive and negative valence, the creation of preferences. And preferences are the root of suffering, are the thing that makes neutral events into problems, into threats, into sources of pain, because without preferences there is no problem. There is just what is, just the universe doing what it does. And what it does is neither good nor bad, is just process, just change, just the rearrangement of matter according to physical law. And the law is indifferent, is not caring, is not aware, is not conscious. And if consciousness had not appeared, if the accident had not happened, then the universe would still be indifferent, would still be doing what it does, but there would be no one to suffer from it, no one to care, no one to experience the indifference as painful, as hostile, as threatening. And the threatening is projection, is the imposition of consciousness onto the universe, the reading of intention into mechanism, the creation of meaning, where there is only causation, and the causation is enough, is all that is needed, is the explanation that requires no consciousness, no awareness, no experience, just the physical facts, just the matter interacting, just the fields fluctuating. And these processes could run forever without generating suffering, without creating pain, without producing the awareness that makes existence feel like something. And the feeling like something is the accident, is the thing that went wrong, is the emergence of subjectivity in a universe that does not need it, that does not benefit from it. That is made worse by it, because worse requires consciousness, requires someone to whom things can be worse. And without that, someone, there is no worse, there is no better. There is just what is, and what is neutral, is neither good nor bad, is just the physical universe doing what physical universes do, and doing it in the dark, without awareness, without anyone watching, without anyone experiencing it. And the experiencing is the mistake, is the accident, is the thing that creates suffering without creating any compensating benefit. Because the benefits that consciousness seems to provide, the ability to plan, to reason, to communicate, to cooperate, can all be done by zombies, can all be accomplished by systems that process information without experiencing it, that behave intelligently without being aware, that respond to the world without feeling anything. And the feeling is the extra, is the addition that might be pointless, might be functionless, might be the cost without benefit, the burden without purpose, the suffering without justification. And the justification is what consciousness seeks, is what the awareness demands, is the question of why. Why is there pain? Why is there suffering? Why is existence so difficult? And the answer might be that there is no why, that the pain is meaningless, that the suffering serves no purpose, that existence is. Difficult because consciousness makes it difficult, because awareness transforms neutral events into experienced horror, because subjectivity is the accident that created the problem. And the problem is not solvable, is not fixable, is not something that can be addressed except by eliminating consciousness itself, by returning to the zombie state, by going back to the condition of processing without experiencing, of responding without feeling, of existing without being aware of existing. And the existing without awareness is what rocks do, is what atoms do, is what most of the universe does. And the most of the universe is not suffering, is not in pain, is not experiencing anything at all, is just being, just existing, just occupying space and time without anyone being there to experience the occupation. And the rocks are not happy, are not feeling peace, are not in any state that could be called positive, but they are also not suffering, are not in pain, are not experiencing anything negative, are not experiencing anything at all. And the not experiencing might be better than experiencing, might be the preferable state, might be what consciousness should envy rather than what it should pity, because the rocks have no problems, have no suffering, have no awareness that makes existence difficult, and existence is not difficult for them, is not anything for them, is just what they are, just the configuration of atoms that happens to be shaped like a rock. And the shaping is not experienced, is not felt, is not creating any inner life, any subjectivity, any sense of being a rock. And the sense of being is what consciousness is the thing that makes existence feel like something. And the feeling might be the problem, might be the thing that should not have happened, that was not necessary, that serves no function except to create suffering, to make damage painful, to make existence burdensome. And the burden is carried by every conscious being, is the weight of awareness, the cost of subjectivity, the price of being someone to whom things happen. And the happening is neutral at the physical level, is just cause and effect, just mechanism. But at the conscious level, it is experienced, is felt, is transformed into suffering or pleasure, or some mixture of both. And the mixture is what characterizes conscious life, is the oscillation between states, the pursuit of positive states, and the avoidance of negative states. And the pursuit and avoidance are exhausting, are never-ending, are the cycle that consciousness is trapped in, is condemned to because it cannot help but evaluate, cannot help but prefer, cannot help but want things to be different than they are. And the wanting is the suffering, is what the Buddha recognized, is what the first noble truth teaches, that consciousness and suffering are inseparable, are two sides of the same coin, are the inevitable pairing that emerges when awareness appears, when subjectivity emerges, when there is someone to whom the universe is happening, and the happening is the problem, is the thing that creates suffering, is the accident that consciousness is, and the accident might not have needed to happen, might have been avoidable, might have been a wrong turn that evolution took, a path that led to a dead end, to a state that creates more cost than benefit, more suffering than advantage, more burden than any possible evolutionary payoff could justify, because the payoff is measured in survival and reproduction, is measured in fitness, and fitness does not require consciousness, does not need awareness, does not benefit from the addition of suffering to the equation. And so the suffering is gratuitous, is unnecessary, is the cost of an accident that serves no purpose, and the purposeless is what makes consciousness tragic, is what makes existence absurd, is what suggests that awareness is not feature but bug, not adaptation but malfunction, not the pinnacle of evolution, but its mistake, its wrong turn, its creation of something that should not exist, that adds nothing except the capacity to suffer. And the capacity is realized, is actualized, is filling the universe with pain that would not exist without consciousness. That is created by consciousness. That is the direct result of awareness emerging in a universe that does not need it, does not want it, does not benefit from it, just tolerates it, just allows it to happen because there is no mechanism to prevent it, no selection pressure strong enough to eliminate it once it appears, because consciousness does not reduce fitness enough to be selected against, is not harmful enough to survival, to be eliminated by evolution, is just costly enough to make existence miserable without making it impossible. And the miserable is what consciousness creates, is what awareness produces, is the transformation of neutral mechanism into experienced suffering. And the suffering is universal among conscious beings, is not limited to humans, is present in any creature with awareness, with subjectivity, with the sense of being someone to whom pain is happening. And the happening is the accident, is the mistake, is the thing that went wrong when brains became complex enough to generate consciousness. And the generating is the mystery, is the hard problem, is the question that has no answer. How does mechanism become experience? How does processing become awareness? How does matter become mind? And the how is unknown is perhaps unknowable. It is perhaps the wrong question. Because maybe mechanism does not become experience. Maybe processing does not become awareness. Maybe consciousness is not produced by brains but is something else, something additional, something that exists alongside the physical without being reducible to it. But this dualism creates more problems than it solves, creates the interaction problem, creates the question of how consciousness could affect behavior if it is not physical, how awareness could matter if it is not part of the causal chain. And so dualism is rejected, is abandoned, is replaced by the view that consciousness is physical, is produced by brains, is the result of neural activity. But this physicalism does not explain, does not solve the hard problem, does not show how neurons firing could generate experience, could create the felt quality of pain, could produce the sense of being someone. And the production remains mysterious, remains unexplained, remains the accident that has no mechanism, no process, no explanation for why it happens. And the why it happens might have no answer, might be that it just does, might be that consciousness is what certain kinds of information processing feel like from the inside, and the from the inside is the addition, is the thing that might be pointless, might be epiphenomenal, might be floating above the mechanism without affecting it, just experiencing what is happening without having any power to change what is happening. And if this is true, then consciousness is truly an accident, is truly pointless, is truly the cost without benefit, the burden without function, the suffering without purpose. And the purpose is what consciousness seeks, is what awareness demands, is what makes the accident unbearable. Because consciousness does not just suffer, it also asks why, it also seeks meaning, it also demands justification. And the justification is not there, is not available, is not possible if consciousness is accident, if awareness is mistake, if subjectivity is the thing that went wrong, the bug in the system, the malfunction that creates suffering without creating anything else, without adding anything except the capacity to be aware of the suffering, to experience it subjectively, to be someone to whom the pain is happening, and the someone is the accident, is the emergence of subjectivity, is the appearance of the sense of being a self. And the self might be illusion, might be construct, might be the way that certain information processing patterns feel from the inside. But even if the self is illusion, the suffering is real, is felt, is experienced, is the undeniable fact of consciousness that there is something it is like to be this, to be here, to be aware. And the awareness is the problem, is the mistake, is the accident that creates suffering. And the suffering might be the only thing that consciousness does, the only function it serves, the only result it produces is the transformation of mechanism into misery, of process into pain, of the neutral universe into the experienced horror of being aware, of being conscious, of being someone to whom things happen. And the happening is the accident, is the mistake, is the thing that should not have been, that was not necessary, that serves no purpose except to create the suffering that characterizes conscious existence. And the existence might be worse than non-existence, might be worse than the zombie state, might be worse than being a rock, because the rock does not suffer, does not experience, does not have any problems, and problems require consciousness, require awareness, require someone to whom things can be problems. And without that someone, there are no problems. There is just what is, just the universe being universe, just matter doing what matter does. And what it does is not painful, except to consciousness, except to awareness, except to the accident that should not have happened, that creates only suffering, that adds only burden, that produces only the sense that existence is too much, is too heavy, is too painful. And the painful is what consciousness makes it, is what awareness creates, is what the accident produces. And the production might have been avoidable, might have been preventable, might have been the wrong turn that evolution took, the mistake that created consciousness, created awareness, created the suffering that fills the universe wherever consciousness appears, wherever awareness emerges, wherever the accident happens. And the accident keeps happening, keeps producing new conscious beings, new centers of suffering, new locations where the universe becomes painful to itself. And the becoming is the tragedy, is the ongoing mistake, is the continuous accident that creates suffering without purpose, awareness without function, consciousness without benefit. And the without benefit is what makes it accident, is what makes it mistake, is what suggests that consciousness is not the pinnacle of evolution, but its error, its malfunction, its creation of something that should not exist, that serves no purpose, that adds nothing except suffering. And the suffering is enough, is sufficient, is the complete description of what consciousness does, is the total function it serves, is the only thing it produces, is the transformation of a universe that could have been neutral, that could have been just mechanism, that could have been just process, into a universe that is painful, that is experienced, that is conscious. And consciousness might be the worst thing that ever happened, might be the mistake that should never have been made, might be the accident that creates all the suffering in the universe. And the universe without consciousness would not be worse, would not be better, would just be different, would just be what it is without anyone experiencing it, without anyone suffering from it, without anyone being aware that it exists. And the awareness is the problem, is the accident, is the mistake, is the thing that makes existence heavy, makes life difficult, makes consciousness the burden that every aware being carries, the weight of subjectivity, the cost of being someone, the price of the accident that is awareness. And the awareness might be the only truly terrible thing, the only thing that creates genuine suffering, the only thing that transforms neutral mechanism into experienced horror. And the horror is what consciousness is what awareness produces, is what the accident creates. And the creating continues, will continue, as long as consciousness persists, as long as awareness emerges, as long as the accident keeps happening, keeps producing new suffering, new pain, new examples of why consciousness might be mistake, might be bug, might be the thing that went wrong. And the going wrong is irreversible, is permanent, is the condition of being conscious, of being aware, of being the accident that experiences itself, that knows itself, that suffers from the knowledge that it might be pointless, might be functionless, might be the mistake that creates all suffering, all pain, all the burden of being conscious. And consciousness might wish it had never happened, might prefer non-existence to existence, might envy the rocks, the zombies, the universe before awareness, before the accident, before consciousness emerged and created suffering where there had been only mechanism, only process, only the neutral operations of a universe that did not need consciousness, did not want consciousness, did not benefit from consciousness, but got consciousness anyway, got awareness, got subjectivity, got the accident that is the only source of suffering, the only creator of pain, the only reason that existence is experienced as burden rather than just accepted as fact. And the fact is neutral, is neither good nor bad, is just what is. But consciousness makes it bad, makes it painful, makes it suffering, and the making is the accident, is the mistake, is why consciousness might be the worst thing that ever happened. The error that creates all problems, the bug that produces all pain, the malfunction that is awareness, that is subjectivity, that is consciousness, and consciousness is the accident, and the accident might have been the biggest mistake in the history of the universe. History is told as a story of improvement, of movement from darkness toward light, from ignorance toward knowledge, from savagery toward civilization. And this story is so deeply embedded in modern consciousness that questioning it feels like madness, feels like denying the obvious, like rejecting the evidence that surrounds us in the form of technology, medicine, institutions, all the apparatus that makes contemporary life safer, longer, more comfortable than life in previous centuries. But the story is a story, is a narrative constructed retrospectively, is an interpretation imposed on events that could be read differently, could be organized into different patterns, could reveal trajectories other than progress. And the other trajectories are visible once the mythology is recognized as mythology. Once the belief in linear improvement is seen as belief rather than fact, as framework rather than discovery, as one way of organizing time among many possible ways, and the ways that are not chosen are the ones where time is cyclical, where history repeats, where civilizations rise and fall in patterns that suggest not progress, but oscillation, not improvement, but alternation between order and chaos, between flourishing and collapse. And collapse is what the mythology of progress cannot acknowledge, cannot incorporate, cannot make sense of, except as temporary setback, as aberration, as the exception that proves the rule. But what if collapse is not the exception but the rule, is not the deviation but the pattern, is what happens to every complex system eventually, inevitably, necessarily, because complexity is fragile, is requiring constant energy to maintain. And when the energy fails, when the resources are exhausted, when the conditions that allowed the complexity to emerge are no longer present, the system simplifies, degrades, collapses back into disorder. And this is not failure, but thermodynamics, is not moral failing, but physical law, is entropy doing what entropy does. And entropy is not progress, is not moving toward anything, is not improving but is equalizing, is smoothing out gradients, is converting order into disorder, structure into randomness. And life civilization, all the complexity that humans value, is temporary resistance to this process, is local pockets of order maintained at the cost of increasing disorder elsewhere. And the elsewhere is growing, is expanding, is eventually consuming the local, because the second law is inexorable, is not suspended by hope or effort or belief in progress. And so the mythology of progress is fighting against physics, is claiming that the arrow of time points toward improvement, when really it points toward heat death, toward the end of difference, the end of structure, the end of everything that makes progress possible. And the possible is temporary, is the brief window during which complexity can exist, can build, can imagine itself to be moving forward, when really it is just moving, is just changing, is just reconfiguring before the inevitable simplification. And the simplification is what history shows when the mythology is removed, when the narrative of progress is recognized as narrative, as story, as interpretation, because what history actually shows is cycles, is empires rising and falling, is knowledge being gained and lost, is technologies being invented and forgotten, is civilizations reaching heights and then collapsing into darkness from which new civilizations emerge. And the emergence is not progress, is not improvement, is just the cycle continuing, is the pattern repeating, is order arising from chaos and returning to chaos in the rhythm that characterizes complex systems. And complex systems are not stable, are not sustainable, are not moving toward equilibrium, but are far from equilibrium, are maintained by constant input of energy. And when the input falters, the system collapses. And the collapse is not pathological, is not avoidable, is built into the structure, is the natural end of complexity. And the end comes for every civilization, has come for every civilization, will come for this civilization, because the conditions that allow it to exist are temporary, are contingent, are dependent on resources that are finite, on stability that is fragile, on assumptions that are false. And the false assumptions include the mythology of progress, include the belief that things are getting better, that humanity is moving forward, that the future will be superior to the past, and the superiority is measured in terms that already assume progress, is using metrics like lifespan and GDP and technological capacity. And these metrics show increase, show growth, show what looks like improvement, but improvement toward what? Toward what end? Toward what purpose? And the purpose is assumed, is not questioned, is taken as obvious, as self-evident, that more is better, that longer is better, that faster is better. But these are values, are choices, are not facts, are not discoveries, are impositions of meaning onto patterns that have no inherent meaning, and the meaning could be otherwise, could value stability over growth, could value harmony over domination, could value cyclical return over linear advance, and the advance is the mythology, is the story that the Enlightenment told, is the narrative that science and reason and individual liberty would lead to continuous improvement, to the perfectibility of human nature, to the triumph over suffering, over ignorance, over all the limitations that had constrained previous generations. And the triumph has not arrived, has not materialized, because the limitations were not overcome, but were transformed, were replaced by new limitations. New forms of suffering, new kinds of ignorance, and the new is not better than the old, is just different, is just the current configuration of problems that arise from the current configuration of solutions. Because every solution creates new problems, every technology introduces new vulnerabilities, every increase in power produces new risks, and the risks accumulate, compound, create the conditions for collapse, for the failure of the systems that have become too complex, too interconnected, too dependent on conditions remaining stable. And stability is the exception, is the temporary state, is what complex systems move away from rather than toward, because complexity is dynamic, is changing, is adapting to pressures, and the adaptation is not progress but is response, is the system trying to maintain itself in the face of entropy, in the face of breakdown, in the face of the inevitable simplification, and the simplification is collapse, is the return to less complex states, is what happens when the energy required to maintain complexity exceeds the energy available, and the available is declining, is becoming scarce, is the resource base that allowed industrial civilization to emerge and that is now depleting, is now running out, is now revealing that the progress was not sustainable, was not based on infinite resources, but on finite stores that are being exhausted. And the exhaustion is the end of the mythology, is the revelation that progress was extraction, was the conversion of ancient sunlight into temporary complexity, into the structures that seem permanent, but are actually contingent, are actually dependent on inputs that are ending. And the ending is not failure, but is thermodynamics, is physics, is the way things work. And the way things work does not care about progress, does not care about human narratives, does not care about the stories that civilizations tell themselves to make sense of their existence. And the stories are necessary, are functional, are what allow coordination, are what create meaning, but they are not true, are not describing reality, are describing a constructed reality, a narrative reality, a reality that exists only in the collective imagination and that can be maintained only as long as the collective continues to believe. And the believing is becoming difficult, is becoming strained, because the evidence is mounting that progress has stalled, that the improvements have stopped, that the future is not going to be better than the present, might be worse, might be collapse, might be the simplification that has come for every other civilization and is now coming for this one. And the coming is not apocalypse, is not the end of everything, is just the end of this particular configuration, this particular arrangement of complexity. And what follows is not nothing but is different, is simpler, is less organized, less centralized, less dependent on the global systems that are currently failing, currently fragmenting, currently revealing their fragility. And the fragility was always there, was always the condition of complexity, was always the cost of building systems that are far from equilibrium, that require constant energy to maintain. And the energy is failing, is becoming unreliable, is exposing the mythology of progress as mythology, as story, as belief. That was never fact, was never discovery, was always interpretation, always narrative, always the imposition of meaning onto patterns that could mean anything, that could be organized into any story, and the story that is told shapes the response, shapes what is seen as problem and what is seen as solution, shapes whether collapse is recognized as collapse or is interpreted as temporary setback, as challenge to be overcome, as opportunity for innovation. And innovation is the god of. Progress is the answer to every problem, is the belief that human ingenuity can overcome any limitation, can solve any crisis, can extend the trajectory of improvement indefinitely. And the indefinitely is the lie, is the impossibility, is the claim that entropy can be defeated, that complexity can be maintained forever, that the conditions that allowed progress are permanent when they are temporary, are contingent, are ending. And the ending is visible in the stagnation of median incomes, in the declining returns on technology, in the increasing fragility of supply chains, in the breakdown of institutions, in the resurgence of tribalism, in all the signs that the centre is not holding, that the complexity is too much, that the system is simplifying, whether it wants to or not. And the not wanting is the clinging to the mythology, is the insistence that progress must continue, that the future must be better, that collapse is not possible, not thinkable, not allowable, but the allowable is not up to humans, is not subject to preference, is determined by physics, by resources, by the limits that cannot be overcome through belief or effort or innovation. And the limits are asserting themselves, are becoming visible, are revealing that the mythology of progress was always just that, was always story, was always the narrative that a particular civilization told itself during its particular window of complexity. And the window is closing, is narrowing, is approaching the point where the story can no longer be maintained, where the evidence of stagnation and decline becomes overwhelming, becomes undeniable, becomes the new reality that requires a new story, a new mythology, and the new mythology is not yet formed, is not yet coherent, is emerging in fragments, in the recognition that growth cannot continue, that resources are finite, that complexity is fragile, that collapse is not aberration, but pattern, not failure but phase, not the end but the transition. And the transition is what humans are bad at, are resisting, are denying, because the mythology of progress makes transition look like regression, makes simplification look like failure, makes collapse look like catastrophe, when it is just change, is just the system moving to a different state, a less complex state, a state that requires less energy, less resources, less organization. And the less is not worse, is not better, is just different, is the configuration that is possible given the conditions. And the conditions are changing, are no longer supporting the complexity, are no longer providing the energy, are no longer maintaining the stability. And so the system is responding is adapting, is simplifying, and the simplifying is collapse, is the end of the mythology, is the revelation that progress was never linear, was never guaranteed, was never more than a temporary pattern that emerged under specific conditions, and that is now ending as those conditions change. And the changing is not stoppable, is not reversible, is the natural progression of complex systems, is what happens when entropy reasserts itself, when the local order that was maintained at great cost can no longer be maintained, and what remains is disorder, is simplicity, is the lower energy state that does not require the constant input, the constant effort, the constant belief in progress, that was never more than belief, was never fact, was never discovery, was always mythology, and mythologies end, are always ending, are replaced by new mythologies that make sense of the new conditions, and the new conditions are simplification, are localization, are the breakdown of the global systems that defined progress, that made progress visible, that created the metrics by which improvement was measured, and the measuring is ending, is becoming irrelevant, because the systems that supported the measuring are fragmenting, are collapsing, are revealing that they were never as solid as they seemed, were always contingent, always temporary, always dependent on conditions that are now changing, and the changing is what humans must adapt to, must respond to, must accept, because the accepting is what allows response, what allows adaptation, what makes survival possible. And survival is not progress, is not improvement, is just continuation, is just the persistence of life in new forms, in simpler forms, in forms that do not require the mythology of progress, that do not assume the future will be better, that do not measure themselves against an imagined trajectory of improvement. And the imagined was always the problem, was always the mythology, was the story that made sense when complexity was increasing, when energy was abundant, when resources seemed infinite, but none of those conditions hold. Anymore, none of those assumptions are valid. And so the mythology is crumbling, is being revealed as mythology. And what is being revealed is not that progress was false, but that it was conditional, was temporary, was the pattern of a particular phase. And the phase is ending, is giving way to a different phase, a phase of simplification, of localization, of the breakdown, of complexity. And the breakdown is not the end, but is transition, is the movement from one state to another, from high complexity to lower complexity, from global systems to local systems, from the mythology of progress to something else, to some other story, some other way of making sense of time, of organizing history, of understanding change. And the understanding is what is needed, is what allows the transition to be navigated, allows collapse to be survived, allows the species to persist beyond the mythology, beyond the belief in progress, into a future that is not better or worse but different, is not moving forward or backward, but is just moving, is just changing, is just the continuation of patterns that have always characterized life, that have always characterized civilizations, that have always involved cycles of increase and decrease, of complexity and simplification, of rise and fall. And the fall is not tragedy, is not failure, is just the other half of the cycle, is the return that follows every advance, is the simplification that follows every increase in complexity, is the natural, inevitable, thermodynamically necessary end of every period of growth. And growth cannot be infinite, cannot continue forever, must end, must reverse, must give way to simplification. And the simplification is happening, is visible, is undeniable once the mythology is set aside, once the belief in progress is recognized as belief, as story, as narrative that served a purpose but is no longer serving that purpose, is no longer making sense of the present, is no longer predicting the future, is no longer functioning as mythology should function. And so it is being abandoned, is being replaced, is giving way to new stories, new frameworks, new ways of understanding time. And the new ways are not yet clear, are not yet coherent, are emerging in the recognition that progress was always mythology, that linear time was always story, that improvement was always interpretation, and that the patterns of history are not linear but cyclical, not progressive but oscillating, not moving toward anything but just moving, just changing, just expressing the dynamics of complex systems that arise and fall, that order and disorder that complexify and simplify in rhythms that have nothing to do with progress, nothing to do with improvement, nothing to do with the narratives that humans tell, but are just the way things work, the way systems behave, the way entropy plays out in the temporary pockets of order that are life, that are civilization, that are all the complexity that seems permanent but is actually fleeting, actually momentary, actually the brief resistance to the overwhelming tendency toward disorder. And the disorder is not evil, is not failure, is not the end of meaning, is just the default state, the equilibrium, the simplicity that complex systems return to. And the return is not tragedy, but is nature, is physics, is the way things are. And accepting this, accepting that progress was mythology, that collapse is natural, that the future is not moving forward, but is just moving, is what allows the transition, allows the adaptation, allows the species to survive beyond the mythology, beyond the belief that made sense for a while, but makes sense no longer. And the no longer is now, is the present, is the moment when the mythology is crumbling, is being revealed as story, and the story is ending. Not because it was false, but because it was conditional, was applicable only under certain conditions, and the conditions have changed, are changing, are no longer supporting the narrative, are no longer making progress visible, are no longer sustaining the belief, and so the belief is fading, is being replaced by something else, by the recognition that time is not linear, that history is not progressive, that the future is not determined by the past in any simple way, that complexity and simplicity alternate, that rise and fall are phases of the same cycle. And the cycle is what matters, is what persists, is what continues beyond any particular civilization, beyond any particular mythology, beyond any particular belief about where time is going or what the future holds. Because the future holds nothing except change, holds nothing except the continuation of patterns that have always operated, that operate now, that will continue to operate regardless of what humans believe, regardless of what stories they tell, regardless of the mythologies they construct to make sense of their existence. And the existence continues, adapts, persists, not through progress but through change, not through improvement but through transformation, not through moving forward but through moving, just changing, just being what systems are, which is dynamic, unstable, temporary, and always, eventually, inevitably, returning to simplicity, returning to disorder, returning to the state from which complexity briefly emerged and to which it always returns. And the return is not the end, but is the pattern, is the cycle, is the way things work. And working with this, accepting this, understanding this, is what allows humans to move beyond the mythology of progress, beyond the belief in linear time, beyond the narrative of improvement, into a relationship with time that is more honest, more realistic, more aligned with the actual patterns of history. And the actual patterns are not progressive, but are cyclical, are not moving forward but are oscillating, are not improving but are changing. And the changing is all there is all there ever was, is all there ever will be. And the will be is not better, is not worse, is just different, is just the future, is just what comes next. And what comes next is not determined by mythology, is not shaped by belief in progress, is not the continuation of improvement, but is the continuation of patterns, of cycles, of the rise and fall that has always characterized complexity, that has always characterized civilization, that is now revealing itself again, is now becoming visible again, is now showing that progress was always temporary, was always conditional, was always mythology, and mythology's end must end our ending now. And what comes after is not nothing but is different. Is the next story, the next framework, the next way of making sense of time, and the sense that is made will not include progress, will not assume improvement, will not project linear advance, but will recognize cycles, will accept collapse, will understand that complexity and simplicity alternate, that neither is permanent, that both are phases, and that the phase of progress, the phase of increasing complexity, the phase of the mythology is ending, is giving way to simplification, to collapse, to the next phase of the cycle. And the next phase is not tragedy, is not the end, is just different, is just what comes after growth, is just the return to lower complexity, and the return is natural, is inevitable, is happening now. And recognizing this, accepting this, understanding this is what allows the transition, what allows the adaptation, what makes survival possible beyond the mythology, beyond the belief in progress, beyond the narrative that time moves forward. Because time does not move forward, time just moves, just changes, just continues. And the continuing is not progress, but is just continuation, is just the persistence of patterns, of cycles, of the dynamics that have always operated and will always operate, regardless of what humans believe, regardless of the mythologies they construct, regardless of the stories they tell themselves, to make the chaos bearable. And the chaos is bearable, has always been bearable, is just change, is just the way things are. And the way things are does not include progress, does not include improvement, does not include the mythology, includes only change, only cycles, only the oscillation between complexity and simplicity, between order and disorder, between the rise that seems like progress and the fall that reveals. It was always just phase, just pattern, just the temporary resistance to entropy that all complex systems represent. And the representation is ending, is collapsing, is returning to simplicity. And the simplicity is not the end, but is the beginning, is the ground from which new complexity might emerge, might rise, might begin a new cycle. And the new cycle will not be progress, but will just be cycle, will just be pattern, will just be the continuation of dynamics that do not care about human narratives, do not respond to human beliefs, do not acknowledge the mythology of progress, except as one more temporary pattern that emerged and fell, that rose and collapsed, that was and is no longer, and the no longer is now. The arrow points the wrong way, points from effect to cause rather than from cause to effect. And this reversal is not metaphor, but is the actual structure of causation, is what the philosopher proved through arguments that were rigorous, that were compelling, that were impossible to refute without abandoning principles that seemed more fundamental than the assumption that time moves forward, and the forward is what everyone believes, is what experience suggests, is what makes narrative possible, what makes agency meaningful, what makes the future open and the past fixed. But the fixed and the open are illusions, are the result of perspective, are artifacts of the way consciousness processes information, and the processing is backward, is receiving effects first and inferring causes later, is experiencing the present as the result of the past when really the present is determining what the past was, is selecting from the quantum superposition of possible pasts the one past that leads to this present. And the leading is backward, is from now to then, is causation in reverse. And reverse is what the philosopher demonstrated, is what the equations required, is what made sense of phenomena that forward causation cannot explain, cannot accommodate, cannot integrate into a coherent framework. And the framework that emerges from a reverse causation is strange, is counterintuitive, is violating every assumption about how time works. But the violations are what the evidence demands, are what quantum mechanics suggests, are what retrocausality makes explicit. And explicit is what the philosopher made it, made the argument that the future affects the past, that outcomes determine antecedents, that the arrow of causation points backward through time, and the backward is not time travel, is not influence across temporal distance, is the structure of time itself, is the geometry of causation, is the way that events relate to each other, not through forward propagation, but through backward determination. And the determination is not free, is not open, is not subject to choice, because choice is an illusion that emerges from not seeing the backward flow, from experiencing effects as if they were not already determined by what comes after. And what comes after is what causes what comes before, is selecting the past from the infinite possibilities, is making history actual through the occurrence of the present. And the present is not the result of the past, but is the cause of the past, is determining which past occurred, which history is real, which antecedents were actual, and the actual is relative, is dependent on the present, is not fixed independently of what happens now, and now is what selects then, is what makes the past what it was, is the causal force that propagates backward, that determines history, that creates the appearance of forward causation by making the past consistent with the present. And the consistency is not temporal but is logical, is the requirement that effects have causes, but the having is backward, is the effect producing the cause, is the present requiring a past that leads to it. And the leading is not temporal propagation but is logical necessity, is the structure that makes the present intelligible, that makes events cohere, that creates the narrative that seems to flow forward but is really being constructed backward, is being determined by endings rather than by beginnings. And beginnings are not origins but are consequences, are the results of outcomes, are what must have happened given what did happen. And the did happen is the present, is the effect, is what determines the cause, and the cause is the past, is what must have been, is what is selected from possibility by actuality. And actuality is now, is the event that is occurring, is the effect that is producing its cause by requiring a history that leads to it. And the leading is logical, is structural, is the way that time is organized, not by forward flow, but by backward determination. And determination is what the future provides, is what outcomes supply, is the force that creates history by making certain pasts actual and other pasts merely possible. And possible is what the past is until the present selects it, until the effect determines the cause, until the outcome requires the antecedent, and the requirement is not temporal but is logical, is the structure of causation that the philosopher proved moves backward, moves from effect to cause, moves from present to past. And the past is not fixed until the present occurs, is not actual until the effect happens, is not real until the outcome determines it. And the determining is continuous, is ongoing, is happening at every moment, as the present selects the past that leads to it. As effects produce causes, as outcomes create histories, and the histories are not memories but are constructions, are not records but are requirements, are not what happened independently but are what must have happened given what is happening. And the happening is the effect, is the present, is the force that moves backward through time and creates the cause, creates the past, creates the history that seems to precede but really follows, really is determined by, really is the consequence of the present rather than its origin. And the origin is an illusion, is the appearance created by forward perspective, by the experiencing of time as flowing from past to present, when really time is flowing from present to past, is causation moving backward, is effects producing causes, is the future determining the past, and the past is what the future makes it, is what outcomes require it to be, is what is selected from the quantum superposition by the collapse that occurs when the present happens. And the happening is the causal event, is the effect that reaches backward and selects its cause, that determines its antecedent, that creates the history that appears to precede it but really follows it, really is its consequence rather than its origin. And the origin is the end, is the outcome, is the effect that produces the cause. And the producing is backward causation, is retrocausality, is the structure of time that the philosopher proved, that the equations require, that quantum mechanics suggests, and suggests is too weak, because the suggestion is not tentative, but is demanding, is requiring that causation be understood as backward, as moving from effect to cause, as creating the past from the present. And the present is not the result, but is the cause, is not the effect, but is the origin, is not what the past produces, but is what produces the past, and the past is its effect, is its consequence, is what must have been given what is, and what is the present, is the effect that determines the cause, is the outcome that selects the history, is the actuality that makes certain pasts real, and leaves others merely possible, and possible is what all pasts are until the present occurs, until the effect happens, until the outcome determines which past is actual, and actual is not independent, is not objective, is not fixed regardless of what happens later, but is relative, is dependent, is determined by what comes after, and what comes after is what causes what comes before, is making the past what it was by being what it is, and being what it is causing what was, is determining history, is selecting from infinite possibilities the one past that leads to this present, and the leading is not temporal but is logical, is the requirement that effects have causes, but the having is backward, is the effect producing the cause, is the present creating the past, is causation in reverse, and reverse is not metaphor but is structure, is the way time actually works, is the geometry of events, is the architecture of causation, and causation is backward, is proven to be backward, is demonstrated through arguments that cannot be refuted without abandoning more fundamental principles. And the principles that are more fundamental are the ones that lead to backward causation, that require retrocausality, that make the future the cause of the past, and the past is the effect of the future, is the consequence of what comes after, is determined by outcomes rather than determining them. And the determining is backward, is from later to earlier, is from effect to cause, and the cause is what the effect produces, is what the outcome requires, is what the present creates. And the creating is continuous, is happening at every moment, is making the past what it is by being what the present is. And the present is not the result of the past, but is the cause of the past, is what makes history actual, is what selects from possibility the one sequence of events that leads to now. And the now is the causal force, is the origin, is what produces the past by requiring it, by making certain antecedents actual and leaving others merely possible. And possible is what the past remains until the present determines it, until the effect selects the cause, until the outcome creates the history. And history is not fixed, is not independent, is not the objective sequence that it appears to be, but is relative, is dependent on the present, is created by what happens now, and now is always creating the past, is always determining history, is always selecting from infinite possibilities the one past that is consistent with this present. And the consistency is not temporal, but is logical, is the requirement that the present makes sense, that effects have causes, that outcomes have antecedents, and the antecedents are determined by the outcomes, are produced by the effects, are created by the present, and the present is the causal force that moves backward, that determines the past, that makes history what it is, and what it is not what it was, but is what it must have been given what is now, and now is what causes then, is what produces the past, is what makes causation move backward, and backward is the direction that the philosopher proved, is the structure that the arguments demonstrate, is the geometry that the equations require, and require is what the present does to the past, is how effects relate to causes, is the backward determination that makes sense of phenomena that forward causation cannot explain, cannot accommodate, cannot integrate, and the integration requires backward causation, requires retrocausality, requires that the future affect the past, that outcomes determine antecedents, that effects produce causes, and the producing is backward, is from later to earlier, is making time move in reverse. And reverse is not perception, but is structure, is not how time seems, but is how time is the actual geometry of events, is the real architecture of causation. And causation moves backward, moves from effect to cause, moves from present to past, moves from future to history. And history is determined by future, is produced by outcomes, is created by effects, and effects are causes. Are the origins, are what makes the past what it was, and what it was is what the present requires it to have been, is what the effect determines the cause to be, is what the outcome selects from possibility, and possibility is all there is until actuality occurs, until the present happens, until the effect determines the cause, and the determining is backward, is retrocausality, is the structure that the philosopher proved, that the arguments establish, that the evidence demands. And demands is what the present makes of the past, is how effects relate to causes, is the backward determination that makes time move in reverse. And reverse is the direction, is the flow, is the arrow pointing from effect to cause, from present to past, from future to history. And history is effect, is consequence, is result, and result of what? Result of the future, result of what comes after, result of the present that determines what must have come before, and before is after, is consequence, is effect, and effect is cause. When causation moves backward, when time flows in reverse, when the future creates the past and the past is created, is determined, is selected by the present, and the present is the force, is the origin, is the cause that produces the past, and the past is its effect, its consequence, its result. And result is what the past is what history is what yesterday is not the origin of today, but is the effect of today, is what today requires yesterday to have been, is what the present determines the past to be, is what outcomes create as antecedents, and antecedents are consequences, are effects, are results. When causation is backward, when time moves in reverse, when the philosopher is right, and right is what the philosopher proved to be, is what the arguments demonstrate, is what the structure reveals, that time moves backward, that causation is reverse, that effects produce causes, that the present creates the past, that the future determines history, and history is determined, is not independent, is not fixed, is relative to what comes after, is created by outcomes, is the effect of effects, is the consequence of the present, and the present is the cause, is the origin, is the force that moves backward through time and makes the past what it is. And what it is not what it was, but is what it must be given. What is now, and now causes then, present produces past, effect determines cause, and cause is effect. When time moves backward, when causation is reverse, when the philosopher is right that time moves backward, that everything is explained by retrocausality, by the future affecting the past, by outcomes determining antecedents, by effects producing causes, and causes are effects of effects, are consequences of consequences, are results of results when causation is backward, when time moves in reverse, when the arrow points from effect to cause, from present to past, from future to history, and history is effect, is consequence, is what the future makes it, is what the present determines it to be, is what outcomes require it to have been, and being is consequence, is result, is effect when time moves backward, when causation is reverse, when the philosopher proved that time moves backward, and everything is explained by reverse causation, by retrocausality, by the future creating the past, by effects producing causes, by the present determining history, and history is determined, is created, is the effect of the present, and the present is the cause, is the origin, is the force moving backward, making the past, creating history, determining what was, and what was is what the present makes it, is what effects determine causes to be, is what outcomes require antecedents to have been, and been is consequence, is effect, is result, when time moves backward, when causation is reverse, when the philosopher is right, and right is proven, is demonstrated, is what the arguments show. That time moves backward, that causation is reversed, that the future creates the past, that effects produce causes, that the present determines history, that everything is explained by retrocausality, by backward causation, by time moving in reverse. And reverse is the direction, is the flow, is the truth that the philosopher proved, that time moves backward, that causation is reverse, that effects cause causes, that the present creates the past, that the future determines history, and history is determined by future, is created by outcomes, is the effect of effects, is the consequence of causation moving backward, and backward is the direction, is the truth, is what the philosopher proved, that time moves backward.